Okay, students, this video is going to take you through how to properly set up a lab in your lab notebook. And what I have here is actually a picture of page 1 of the graph paper section of the lab notebook. So we'll address the table of contents in class as a group, but what you want to do is open up your lab notebook to the page that looks like this, and you're looking for page 1 in the upper right hand corner, and you'll notice that there's another page 1 directly underneath that. That is the carbon paper, and what you want to do is take that periodic table divider, that hard laminated page that's in there, place that under the second page 1. So you have the bluish gray page 1, then a yellow copy page that's also labeled page 1. Stick the periodic table divider in there, slide it as far over as you can, and what that does is the pressure that you're placing on the page that you see in front of you where you write will then transfer onto the page underneath. It's important that you use a regular ballpoint pen. Felt tip pens don't work real well, and your lab notebook should be in blue or black pen. You shouldn't be using green or purple or other fun colors. Although they're fun, they're not appropriate for the lab notebook. And the first thing you're going to do every time you start a new lab is set up the heading, which is this darker gray section that's up above. And this is our first experiment in the lab notebook, so we're going to, even though it's not our first experiment of the year, so we're going to call it experiment 1. And the first thing you're going to notice is that I'm writing on an iPad for you to view here. So my writing's not going to be as great as yours is, because you can rest your hand on your lab notebook. But be careful, remember that any pressure that you put that's hard pressure down on this page is going to transfer into the other page, which is why you have the divider underneath, but it is also why you can't put pieces of paper on top of your lab notebook and write on them. And then the next thing you're going to do is write the actual experiment name, and that is Hydrate Lab. And again, you have to forgive my handwriting because it is tough to write on these. And then you're going to include today's date. And for me, I'm making this updated video today, which is October the 9th. The next thing you're going to complete is your name. And so for me, this is Mrs. Alvarez. And remember, this is both for my class and Miss Adams' class. So if you're in Miss Adams' class, don't worry about it. The lab notebook prep is the same. And that's why we're both using the same video. And then lab partner, include your lab partner's name. Don't do that in advance, because if your lab partner happens to be absent, then you have to scratch it out to put the next person's name in. We don't have locker or desk number assignments. You don't have to fill in course and number, but some kids like to keep straight which labs they did in the first year and which labs they did in the second year. So if you want to include the designation of AP1 there, go ahead. Otherwise, those two spots can stay blank. And that's your heading. Now, for the heading, that needs to occur on every page. So every time you start a new page, you need to complete the heading on that next page. Now, what you want to do next is take some time to actually read over the lab handout that you have in front of you. And once you've taken some time to read over that lab handout, then you can go ahead and move on to the next steps in your lab notebook. And what I'm going to do in this video is take you through each one of those sections and tell you what should be included in each section. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that there is a center line that runs down the center of the lab notebook. You're going to ignore that center line, and I drew it in just for emphasis. Please do not draw in the center line on your lab notebook, okay? That center line is there for some other purposes. I'm going to erase it. You don't do two separate columns. You write all the way across the page when you're doing your lab notebook. So please make sure over the course of this process that you're writing straight across the whole page. The first section that's going to appear in your lab notebook is referred to as the introduction. And the introduction has two subheadings for it. So the first thing you're going to do, switch back to pen, is write the word introduction all the way over to the left-hand side, colon and underline. Now, typically most students just use one block high in their lab notebook. It's pretty tough for me to do that here. Let me see if I can expand this a little bit more, make it a little bit neater for you. But typically we use one block as like one line on the lab notebook. And then underneath that, you want to indent a few spaces. There's no rule as to exactly how many spaces you have to indent. And then the first subheading under the introduction is the background section. And once again, underline and colon. And again, that's just indented a few blocks. And what you're going to include here is don't write what I'm writing. I'm telling you a summary of what goes in this section. First of all, it must be in paragraph form. That's the first rule of the background section. And in labs like this one, where we give you a pretty extensive summary, you're going to read the background section that's on the lab handout, and then you're going to summarize what's on the handout. So it's going to be a summary of background from the handout. Of background from handout. Okay? And then the next section under that is also a subsection under introduction, and that one is referred to as the safety section. And this is going to be very similar to what you did when you looked up the MSDS for copper chloride dihydrate, the copper 2 chloride dihydrate, and the chemical and physical properties lab. So you're going to look up the safety for the 3 chemicals that are involved in this particular lab, and that's your copper 2 sulfate pentahydrate, the nickel hydrated compound, and the cobalt hydrated compound. So when you refer to your handout, it'll tell you what the 3 chemicals are, and you're going to use the MSDS online. Now, what you want to do is not anything close to as extensive as what you did in the chemical physical properties lab. What I suggest you do, and I'll just show it to you via the copper 2 sulfate pentahydrate, is write the chemical formula. You can also use the chemical name, but the chemical formula is a bit faster for the chemical. And then immediately following that, you don't have to put a colon or a dash or anything because that can look odd. Go right into the safety for that chemical. So you might say something like toxic, flammable. Now, I'm not saying that copper 2 sulfate pentahydrate is toxic and flammable. I'm giving you examples. And you would continue on. So these squiggly lines are me including all that. So any safety concerns as far as toxicity and that type of thing, and then also include what things you need to be aware of from a safety protection perspective. So it would include wearing goggles, etc. Now you're going to find that that's going to be a standard with everything. So what you probably want to do is include the chemical and the individual information for that chemical. So there's going to be a total of 3 for this one. So then you'll have the next one and its information, and then you'll have the third chemical and its information. And then when you've listed all of that, then you could make a generic statement at the bottom that says wear safety goggles, apron, closed-toed shoes. So that generic safety statement can go on every single lab. And that takes you through the safety. So what we did in the chemical and physical lab was much more extensive discussion of safety. So what you have so far is, and I'll just make this small again so you can see the whole thing. You've got your completed heading, introduction goes all the way to the left, and then background and safety are considered subheadings of the introduction. Now, any time that you're going to have a lab that's going to involve some equations, that also gets included as part of the introduction section. So the next thing down is going to be a section labeled equations, and I took a moment to point that out so that you could see this is now the third subsection under the introduction, because these are all introductory pieces of information. And then any equations that would be involved in the lab would be written here. Now, things like subtraction steps or that type of thing wouldn't be included here. What I'm talking about is actual equations like volume equals length times width times height, or density equals mass divided by volume. Percent error would also be an example of an equation that would possibly be included here. So all those types of equations would be included in this section. In this particular lab, the only equation that you're using that is in fact a standard equation is percent error. So what you're going to do is write the name, percent error, so that's the name of the calculation or the formula, and then you're going to indicate the actual formula. Lab minus correct, absolute value, over correct, times 100. And there's different ways to write the percent error formula, so you can write it the way I've done here or some other version of how it was presented in class. And when I say some other version, it's just in how it is referenced. The next thing is you always want to leave a little bit of space after equations before you go on to the next section. And that next section is going to be references. Now, I'm going to go ahead and try to write references in here neatly, even though I have the paper really small, to demonstrate for you what I'm talking about as far as leaving some space. So I have some dead space here, which don't make this circle I'm showing you with this red pen, because if you were to happen to forget some equations and then later on when you're writing your final lab, the end part of your lab report, and you notice that you forgot an equation, this leaves you a little space in there to go back and squeeze them in. If you write references in the next line underneath that section, you're not leaving yourself any space that if you have any mistakes that you can go back and fix those and add those. So just a point of advice is to leave a little extra space there. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and make this larger again for the purposes of writing. Okay, and what are going to be the references in this particular lab? Well, you're going to have an AP lab handout. And that's going to be true essentially for every single lab. So AP lab handout and then what it's called, Hydrates Lab. And then the other thing is your MSDS resource. So if that's sciencelab.org or whatever it happens to be, you'll list whatever you used for your MSDS. And notice I went all the way back over to the left for references because I'm now done with all my subheadings. So let me make this small again so you can see the full page. So introduction has 3 subheadings under it: background, safety, and equations. References is now a new section. So introduction is a section with 3 subsections. References is an individual section. The next section after references is your purpose. Whoops. Helps if you actually get it on there correctly. There we go. Looks a little bit more like a U. Okay, purpose. And your purpose, once again, don't write what I'm writing. I'm giving you the instruction of what should go there. A complete sentence, or sometimes it might be 2 sentences, depending on the length of the purpose, listing the main purpose or purposes of the lab. And that typically will come directly from the handout. And now you can see I'm down to the bottom of the page. And the last thing you should do when you finish a page is initial it, AA, and now I'm dating it. It is still the 9th, and I'll go on to the next page. So when you go on to the next page, you're still, and I thought I had another page in there. I'll erase to show you the next page. You flip, you move your periodic table divider, and each time you start a new page, the date that you put at the top of the page should be the date you start that page, and the date you put at the bottom of the page should be the date that you finish that page. And as far as witness or TA, TA stands for teaching assistant, and that's something that you would see at the college level, so they would initial your page and date it as well to indicate that they were present when you collected this data and that the lab data was in fact authentic. And so now I'm going to take a moment and I'm going to erase while you go ahead, and you should be doing the heading at the top of your next page. So flip the page, put your periodic table divider into the appropriate spot, complete the heading exactly the same way that you did on page 1. Except now it's going to be page 2. So right up here in this corner, this is going to be a 2 up here for you, but everything else is going to be the same. And then we'll continue on with what comes next. And what in fact does come next. Let me go ahead and make this larger again. And if you need to hit pause for a second, feel free. The next section again, all the way over to the left, this is a new section, is the materials section. The materials section should be in list form. And it can be multiple columns, and it should include all of your chemicals. It will also include all of the materials, so that means lab materials like a particular piece of glassware, an electronic balance, all those types of things. So what type of things are going to be used in this lab? Well, you have 3 chemicals you need to list, and they can be listed by chemical formula. You have some materials you're going to be using. You're going to be using an electronic balance. You're going to be using a hot plate, an evaporating dish. So all those would be listed. And again, those can be multiple columns or one big long column. Don't do them as a list separated by commas. Either do it as one big long column or maybe as 2 separate columns side by side to not take up quite as much space. The next thing down is the procedure. Again, new heading. And the procedure is something that sometimes we will ask you to write out the full procedure, especially if it's an experiment where you're designing the procedure, and sometimes we will tell you that it's acceptable to make a note that the procedure can be found in the lab handout. In this particular case, to ensure that you fully understand the procedure, and because this is a pretty straightforward procedure, I would like you to write the procedure into your laboratory notebook. Now, you will notice that there'll be things in the lab handout that you wouldn't necessarily need to include in a formal procedure, but are probably written there because as teachers, we want to make sure that you don't miss these little things because we know you're new in the lab. So you can shorten up the steps in the procedure as long as they're still complete, and you only need to include things you actually need to do to accomplish the lab. So things like cleaning up, washing your hands, and those types of things don't need to be included. So for example, in this lab, step 1 of your procedure might be something like obtain a masked sample of each of 3 hydrated, I should say of each of the, there should be a the in there, each of the, well, I have to remember that unlike you, on my iPad I can erase, obtain a mass sample of each of the 3 hydrated compounds. Now notice I didn't go through all the steps required to do that, and also notice I did it in command form. Obtain a mass sample, not I or you. Obtain a masked sample of each of the 3 hydrated compounds. There's several steps that have to be done for that, like using an evaporating dish, tearing out the balance, etc. But you're talking to a fellow chemist, so it should be inherent that they need to do all those things. So something that might be a 10 or 12 step procedure in the handout might only be 4 or 5 steps total in your lab notebook. So think about how you can tighten up that procedure and summarize it. And so then continuing on, so that arrow means do all of them, not just step 1. And the next section is data and observations. And for this particular lab, we've provided a data table for you, and you can go ahead and copy the data table directly out of the handout. So you'll have a table with columns, etc. Please use a ruler so that your data table is nice and neat. The next section, so I'm going to write the word ruler here to remind you. The next section after that is the calculation section, and you will notice that in the lab handout it also walks you through the calculations. It tells you to only do calculations for the copper sulfate hydrated compound, not for all of the compounds. And the calculations section is something that we'll talk about after the lab is done. So when you get to this point right here, and you've written the word calculations, this is where you would stop your pre-lab work. So that's the point of where you would have to be. And again, what I have written in here in red, you obviously don't write in your notebook. That's where you would stop in advance of the lab. So you'd be down to this point, and then you could write the word calculations or even wait in case you need to add more data than what you originally wrote down for the table. And then your calculations, your conclusion, and any additional post-lab questions will follow in the notebook, but we'll cover that in class after you collect your data. So this is the point you would go up to in advance of starting the lab. Now what you want to do at this point is go ahead, if you've been working on your notebook as you went and watching the video, then you're all set and you're done at this point. If you watch the video the whole way through, you now can open up the video to the pages. The first page where I show the whole page at once, work till you're done with that whole page with the visual reminding what it looks like. And then when you're ready for the material section, opening to this page, hit pause and do all of this page. I hope you find the video helpful.